I'm Savannah Carver, and when I was 15 years old, my parents left me at a bus stop in the middle of Arkansas. No accident, no goodbye. They said it was a survival lesson. I called it the day I stopped being their daughter. I didn't see them again for 20 years, not until they showed up in front of my company with a live stream, tears, and a story about how I abandoned them. They said I owed them everything. But this time I had something they didn't, the truth, and I wasn't afraid to say it. The air was thick with heat, the kind that clings to your skin and makes your clothes feel like damp rags. I was 15, riding in the backseat of our aging silver Suburban as it rumbled down some nameless Arkansas highway. We'd just left my grandmother's house outside Texarkana, and the ride home had been quiet save for the hum of the tires and my parents' occasional bickering up front. I had my headphones in, not listening to anything, just trying to create a barrier between myself and them. Eugene, my father, had that permanent scowl on his face, the one he wore like armor. Darlene, my mother, was chain-smoking with the windows barely cracked, complaining about the heat and how I never offered to drive, even though I didn't have a license yet. That was the kind of logic she lived by. When the Suburban slowed and pulled into a dusty, sun-bleached rest stop, I barely looked up. There was nothing around but a faded sign for a Greyhound station and a few vending machines leaning like tired drunks against the brick wall. Eugene parked the car without a word, then jerked his chin toward the vending machines. "Go get us some drinks." I pulled out my earbuds. What? Darlene turned in her seat, that fake smile already stretched across her lips. "Your dad wants a soda." "I'll take a water, sweetheart." I didn't argue. There wasn't any point. I pushed open the heavy door, the heat hitting me like a punch. My sneakers crunched over the gravel as I made my way to the vending machines, my pocket already digging into my thigh from the $5 bill I'd stuffed in there earlier. The machines wheezed and clunked, groaning like they resented being disturbed. I pressed the buttons, one for soda, one for water, and watched as lukewarm cans dropped into the tray with a sad thud. I turned back, balancing both bottles in one hand, the other shielding my eyes from the sun. The parking lot was empty. I froze. The Suburban was gone. Not moved to another space, not idling somewhere nearby. Gone. My mouth went dry. I stepped forward, scanning the lot, heart thudding like a drumline in my chest. Maybe they were messing with me. Maybe this was some weird, sick joke. Then my phone buzzed. I fumbled it out of my back pocket and looked at the screen. One new message. From Mom. "Let's see how long it takes you to get home. Consider this a lesson in survival." I stared at the words until they blurred. My fingers moved on autopilot, hitting the call button. Voicemail. I tried again. And again. Same hollow beep, same dead silence. I felt the soda bottle crinkle in my grip as I squeezed it too hard. My legs felt like concrete. Around me, the rest stop was still, the only movement a lazy fly circling a trash can and the shimmer of heat on the pavement. They'd done it. They'd actually left me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run after the car, even though it was long gone. But more than anything, I felt something cold and familiar settle in my chest. This wasn't the first time they'd done something cruel and called it love. When I was 10, Eugene locked me outside for an entire night because I spilled juice on the carpet. At 12, Darlene left me at school for 5 hours because I got a B on a math test. They called it character building. I called it what it was: punishment disguised as parenting. I looked down at my phone again. Battery at 21%. I had no charger, no ride, and no idea where I was. I checked my wallet. $97. All the money I'd saved from mowing lawns and babysitting the neighbors' twins. It would have to be enough. I walked toward the tiny ticket office attached to the rest stop, where a man in a faded red vest sat behind a plastic window, flipping through a magazine. He didn't even look up as I stepped inside. "Excuse me," he grunted. "Where's the nearest town with a bus station?" He scratched his neck and finally met my eyes. "Couple miles that way. Follow the highway, turn left at the gas station." I nodded and turned to leave. "Hey kid," I stopped. "It's hot as hell out there. You got water?" I held up the bottle in my hand. He gave a half shrug and looked back down at his magazine. Outside, the sun felt even hotter than before. My shirt stuck to my back, My shoes pinched with every step. But I walked. 1 mile. Then 2. Every time I wanted to stop, I remembered my father's face, the way he barely looked at me, like I was just a nuisance he was forced to drag around. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Mom. Don't call your teacher, figure it out. You're not 5. I blocked the number. Then I did exactly what she told me not to. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I hadn't used in years. Eliza Winslow. My middle school English teacher. She'd given me extra books when I finished ahead of the class. She was the first person who ever asked if I was okay when I showed up to school with bruises on my arm. I pressed call. It rang once. Then twice. Hello. Her voice was the same. Warm, steady, safe. I felt something crack open inside me. Miss Winslow. It's Savannah. I need help. There was a pause just long enough to make my chest ache. Where are you? I choked back a sob. I'm at a bus station in Arkansas. They left me. They really left me. Her voice sharpened with urgency. Stay right where you are, Savannah. I'm coming for you. You hear me? I nodded. Even though she couldn't see me, I hear you. And for the first time in a long time, I believed someone actually meant it. By the time Eliza pulled into the cracked parking lot, dusk had started to settle in. The Arkansas heat was finally beginning to loosen its grip, but my shirt was still damp with sweat and my legs ached from hours of walking and waiting. Her old station wagon rolled to a stop just a few feet from the vending machines, the headlights cutting through the growing shadows. When she stepped out, she looked exactly as I remembered, just a little grayer around the temples and softer in the shoulders. She opened the passenger door and held out a bottle of Gatorade. Drink this first. I took it with shaking hands and downed half of it before I could even say thank you. The sugar hit my bloodstream like a flood and made my knees wobble. Eliza didn't say anything. She just watched me, eyes steady and unreadable, and waited. Once I'd caught my breath, she gestured toward the car. Get in, sweetheart. I climbed into the front seat and clutched the bottle in my lap like it was the only solid thing in the world. We drove for a while in silence. The road stretched ahead, lined by tall pine trees and dark silhouettes of abandoned buildings. My body was still running on adrenaline, every sound amplified, every bump in the road making me flinch. I kept expecting her to ask questions, to try to offer some thin layer of comfort like most adults did when they weren't ready to deal with something real. But she didn't. She just drove. It wasn't until we passed a small green sign that said, "Leaving Hempstead County," that she finally spoke. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to. I stared out the window. I know they're not coming back. Eliza didn't respond. She didn't need to. I turned toward her, my voice low. Why did you come? She glanced at me, then back at the road. Because someone needed to. That was it. No speeches, no lectures, just those 5 words. And somehow they carried more weight than anything I'd ever heard from my own parents. After about an hour, we pulled into a motel just off the highway near Hope. The kind with flickering signs and ice machines that barely worked. Eliza went inside to check us in, then came back with a single-room key and 2 bags of takeout from a local diner. We ate on the edge of the bed, the television playing some low-budget game show in the background. I picked at a grilled cheese, too drained to eat, too wired to sleep. You're safe here tonight, okay? She said it like a promise, not a question. I nodded, even though the word safe still felt like a foreign language to me. After she went to sleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the fan blades spinning shadows across the walls. My mind replayed everything from earlier, the sun-blasted parking lot, the message from Darlene, the look on the ticket clerk's face when I asked for directions. I thought I'd cry, but nothing came. Just silence and the strange hum of the room's old refrigerator. The next morning, Eliza handed me a bag with clothes she'd bought from a Walmart down the road and a toothbrush still in the wrapper. I changed in the bathroom, my body moving slowly like it didn't quite belong to me yet. Over breakfast, she asked if I wanted to call anyone. I shook my head. There was no one else. You could stay with me for a bit. Her voice was careful, like she didn't want to scare me off. Just until we figure something out. I studied her face, searching for signs of pity or obligation, but there was none. Only a calm steadiness, like she'd already made the decision and just needed me to say yes. Where do you live now, Vermont? Near Middlebury. It's quiet. That sounded like another planet. But quiet didn't sound so bad. You'd have your own room. My husband's a pediatrician. We don't have kids, but we've got a big old farmhouse and way too many books. I blinked. You'd really let me stay? She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. You're not staying, you're coming home. At least for now. We drove north for 2 days, stopping only for gas and sleep. I learned more about Eliza in that stretch of highway than I had in the entire year she taught me. She liked black coffee, hated jazz, and had once tried to learn Italian but gave up after 2 weeks. Her husband Malcolm sounded like someone from a novel, quiet, brilliant, slightly awkward. They had a garden, 3 rescue cats, and a porch swing with chipped paint. I tried to imagine myself in that picture and failed. I didn't belong in stories like that. Still, when we finally turned onto a gravel driveway framed by sugar maples and old wooden fencing, something inside me shifted. The Winslow house was tall and white with a wraparound porch and wildflowers spilling from window boxes. It didn't look rich or fancy. It looked lived in. Real. Malcolm met us at the door. He was taller than I expected, with a gentle way of standing that made him seem smaller somehow. He didn't ask questions. Just nodded at me like I was a guest he'd been expecting for years. We've got a room upstairs. Eliza said you might like one with a window seat. I followed them inside, my shoes squeaking on the hardwood floor. Everything smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. The room they gave me was painted soft green. There was a small bed, a desk, and yes, a window seat overlooking the back fields. A bookshelf stood in the corner, half filled with classics and paperbacks. I dropped my backpack on the floor and stood there frozen. Take your time. Eliza's voice drifted in from the doorway. No rush. I sat on the bed, ran my hands over the quilt, and let the silence settle. I didn't know how long I'd stay. I didn't know what came next. But for the first time in forever, I wasn't scared to find out. The first few weeks in Vermont felt like walking through someone else's dream. Every morning I woke up expecting the rug to be pulled out from under me. But it didn't happen. No slamming doors, no yelling. No mind games or disappearing cars. Just Eliza in the kitchen making coffee and Malcolm reading the paper in his worn leather chair. They gave me space without making me feel invisible. I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to being seen without being judged. School started 2 weeks after I arrived. Eliza had arranged everything with the district. I was technically a transfer student, but the guidance counselor didn't ask too many questions. Just had me fill out a stack of forms and told me where to pick up my schedule. The first day was nerve-wracking, like stepping onto a stage where I didn't know my lines. But I kept my head down and did the work. Turns out I was good at school. I always had been, but back home, being smart didn't get you praise. It got you ignored or punished depending on my parents' mood. Here, though, teachers actually noticed. Mrs. Bell, my algebra teacher, called on me by name. Mr. Lin in computer lab gave me extra coding challenges and told me I had a knack for logic. I started staying late in the library. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The quiet rows of books calmed me. The flicker of the computer screen as I solved a tricky problem gave me a feeling I couldn't name at first. It was something close to power but gentler. Like I was building something no one could take from me. One afternoon, Malcolm came home early and found me sitting on the porch with my laptop open deep into a programming puzzle I'd pulled from an online competition site. What are you working on? I turned the screen toward him and explained the problem. It was about identifying security vulnerabilities in a simple app. He listened, nodding slowly. That's impressive. You ever thought about doing this for real? I blinked. Like as a job, he smiled. Why not? I shrugged, unsure how to answer. Back in Arkansas, the idea of having a career, any career, felt like fantasy. You were supposed to graduate, get married, maybe work, retail, or stay home and raise kids. You didn't go to college unless you had money or parents who pushed you. I had neither. Malcolm saw something in my face and sat down beside me. You know, Eliza and I never thought we'd have kids, but we've both worked with students long enough to know when someone's got the spark. You've got it, Savannah. Don't waste it. He wasn't the kind of man to say things he didn't mean. That made his words land harder. Later that week, Eliza brought home a brochure for a summer tech camp hosted by a college in Burlington. She handed it to me casually, like she wasn't watching my reaction, even though I knew she was. They've got scholarships. I already emailed someone about you. Just think about it. I stared at the glossy photos, students building robots, laughing around whiteboards, working in labs with headsets on. They didn't look like me. But something deep in my chest stirred. I folded the brochure and tucked it into my school binder. By spring, my grades were at the top of the class. I'd won a statewide math competition, and Mr. Lin had entered one of my coding projects into a regional showcase. I didn't tell anyone except Eliza and Malcolm. I still felt like if I said the good things out loud, they'd vanish. It wasn't all perfect. I still had nightmares. I still hesitated when Eliza raised her voice to call me down for dinner. I still flinched at the sound of tires on gravel outside the house, half expecting to see my parents' Suburban pulling up to reclaim me like a misplaced piece of furniture. But those moments were starting to fade little by little, like bruises healing beneath the skin. One late afternoon in June, I walked down to the lake behind the Winslow house. It was quiet except for the rustling trees and the occasional drone of insects. The sun was low, spilling gold over the surface of the water. I sat on the old wooden bench by the dock, my shoes digging into the soft earth. I pulled the tech camp brochure from my backpack. It was creased now, the corners curled, the color fading. I'd read every word a dozen times. I didn't tell anyone what I was really thinking that day. Not Eliza, not Malcolm, not my teachers. But as I sat there watching the light shift across the water, a thought took root and refused to leave. MIT. I barely whispered the word in my mind, like saying it too loud would make it disappear. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The place where the best went. Where people built futures from ideas. The old me, the Arkansas me, laughed it off. You MIT. Don't be ridiculous, but the part of me that was growing, the part that had found its voice in code and quiet spaces, that part whispered back. Why not? I didn't make a decision that day. Not officially. But I started to see the path, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. When I walked back to the house, Eliza was watering her garden. She looked up and smiled, then handed me the hose without a word. I took it and helped, both of us moving in rhythm, the smell of damp soil between us. I never told her what I'd decided. I didn't need to. Something in the air had already shifted. Something in me. By the time I turned 18, I had my acceptance letter from MIT folded and taped to the inside of my closet door. The day it arrived, Eliza cried. Malcolm hugged me for the first time. I stared at the envelope like it might vanish if I blinked too fast. In late August, they helped me move into Simmons Hall, my assigned dorm in Cambridge. The building looked like a Tetris game, all strange shapes and silver panels. I remember standing on the sidewalk with my suitcase, heart racing, watching students carry boxes, hug parents, call out to people they hadn't seen all summer. No one was yelling. No one was angry. Just 100 tiny reunions unfolding like soft private fireworks. My room was on the 5th floor. It had a small bed, a desk, and a view of the Charles River. I set up my laptop, arranged a few books on the shelf, and tried to picture myself belonging there. Classes started the next week. Introduction to Algorithms, Computer Systems Engineering, Linear Algebra, and a humanities elective on Ethics and AI. Everything moved fast. I barely had time to breathe between assignments, lectures, and coding sprints. But I didn't mind. The pace kept me from thinking too much. I spent most of my time in the library or the computer lab, often until midnight. I didn't party, I didn't join clubs, I wasn't there to socialize. I was there to prove something to myself more than anyone else. Still, being surrounded by kids who'd gone to private schools, coded since they were 9, or spent summers at Stanford research labs made me feel like I was always 2 steps behind. Even when I aced an exam or solved a lab faster than anyone, I'd hear whispers. One afternoon in late October, we were assigned a group project in systems. 4 of us. Me, a guy named Kyle who wore a Patagonia vest every day, a girl named Priya who was clearly the smartest one in the class, and this other guy Jeremy who didn't say much, but always had a smug expression like he'd already decided the world belonged to him. We were supposed to present a prototype for a secure file sharing system. I did most of the back-end coding, wrote up the documentation, and even caught a vulnerability Kyle had overlooked. The night before our presentation, we met in the common room to rehearse. Jeremy was scrolling through his phone while I walked them through the flowchart. When I finished, he looked up and said, "Pretty polished. Guess foster kids really know how to sell themselves these days." The words landed like a slap. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. Priya blinked, clearly uncomfortable. Kyle let out a low whistle. "Dude." Harsh. Jeremy shrugged. "I'm just saying. You come out of nowhere, get a full ride, beat out people with actual experience. It makes you wonder." The room went silent. I packed up my laptop and walked out. I didn't cry, not right away. I waited until I was back in my dorm, door locked, lights off, sitting on the cold tile floor of my tiny bathroom. My hands trembled. Not from sadness. From rage. I wasn't ashamed of being a foster kid. Not anymore. But to have that used against me, like it made me less legitimate, like my success was some kind of charity prize, it burned. I had worked for every inch of ground I'd gained. Every sleepless night, every test, every line of code. The next morning, I emailed my professor. Subject: request to present solo. I outlined what had happened word for word. I didn't dramatize it, I just told the truth. Then I asked for permission to deliver a solo version of the project with a revised design and additional security features I'd been working on independently. He replied within 2 hours. Approved. Looking forward to it. I stayed up for 3 nights straight. Rebuilt the interface. Improved the encryption algorithm. Added a user verification layer no one else in the class had thought of. I rehearsed my presentation alone in the lab, pacing between whiteboards and empty chairs. On the day of the presentations, I walked into the lecture hall in a plain black sweater, jeans, and my old boots from Vermont. My name was called. Savannah Carver. Solo presentation. I stepped up to the podium, connected my laptop, and began. 15 minutes. I explained the problem. Walked them through the design. Demonstrated a live test. Then I paused and said, "Some people think where you come from determines what you're capable of. I don't believe that. This project wasn't built from privilege. It was built from late night second chances and the belief that security isn't just about data, it's about people." Silence. Then applause. Not just polite, real, loud. I didn't look at Jeremy. I didn't need to. After class, the professor pulled me aside. "That was exceptional. Would you be interested in joining our research initiative this winter?" I nodded, my throat tight. Yes, I would. That night, I called Eliza from my dorm stairwell. She answered on the first ring. "Hey you, okay?" I smiled into the phone. "I think I finally am, and for the first time in my life, I believed I belonged exactly where I was." 8 years went by faster than I ever imagined. One minute I was walking across the stage at MIT in a borrowed cap and gown. The next I was standing in front of a small group of investors in a rented conference room in downtown Denver, pitching an idea that had grown out of every late night, every sleepless coding sprint, and every hard-earned piece of my past. Mindtrace Labs wasn't just a startup, it was the thing I built from scratch to make sense of the world I had crawled out of. A company that specialized in digital truth and AI-powered platform to detect manipulated images, deepfakes, and online impersonation. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a world where people could fabricate anything with a few clicks, I wanted to create something that said, "This is real. This happened. This is who you are." At 28, I secured my first round of funding. By 30, we had 12 employees, a partnership with a national cybersecurity firm, and a valuation hovering just below $2 million. My photo appeared in a regional tech feature with the headline, "Foster Kid Turned Founder Takes on Internet Lies." I hated the title, but I understood why it worked. People love a redemption arc. I lived alone in a high-rise condo overlooking Union Station. My days were packed with meetings, product testing, and investor calls. I spoke at conferences, shook hands with people twice my age who called me impressive and relentless. I rarely corrected them. Let them think it came easy. The past was something I didn't talk about. Not with my team. Not with the press. Not even with the handful of friends I'd managed to keep over the years. Malcolm and Eliza knew the whole story, of course. I visited them every Thanksgiving no matter how busy things got. Vermont still felt like the only place in the world that had no weight attached to my name. Then one morning in early spring, I checked my phone and saw a message from a number I hadn't saved but recognized immediately. Nadine. Hey. Sorry to bother you. I know it's been a long time, but Mom's been sick. Dad's out of work. They need help. Thought you should know. I stared at the message for a long time, my coffee going cold in my hand. There was no greeting. No, how are you? Just a transactional update wrapped in vague guilt. My thumb hovered over the screen. I didn't answer. I didn't delete it either. The next message came 2 days later. This time with a picture. Darlene, in a hospital bed, eyes closed, tubes in her nose. No caption. Just the image. I closed the app and turned off my phone. But it didn't stop there. A week later, I walked into the lobby of Mindtrace and saw a small crowd gathered by the front doors. My assistant Jordan met me by the elevator, her face tense. There's something happening outside. I think you need to see it. I stepped past the glass and into a wall of heat and noise. A smartphone screen was pointed at me. A woman's voice, trembling and familiar, was speaking into it. My daughter. She abandoned us. After everything we gave her. After all we sacrificed. Look at what she's become. She doesn't even answer our calls. Darlene. Standing in the Colorado sun with her hair brushed out and makeup on, looking weaker than I remembered but no less performative. Next to her was Eugene, his arm around her, his face pinched like he was being dragged into the light against his will. A man with a boom mic asked if I had a statement. I turned and walked back inside. That afternoon, the clip hit social media. It spread faster than I could track. Local pages picked it up. A few national ones reposted it with clickbait captions. Tech prodigy disowns ill parents. The comments were worse. Wow. She should be ashamed. This is what money does to people. No heart, just code. I didn't respond. I didn't release a statement. I told Jordan to redirect any media inquiries to legal. Then I buried myself in work. But something inside me had shifted. They had found me. After 20 years of silence, they knew exactly where to aim. Not at my door. At my name. They weren't here because they missed me. They were here because I had something they wanted. And they had figured out the only thing that scared me more than them. Being seen the way they wanted the world to see me. I stayed late that night, sitting at my desk with the lights dimmed, the city twinkling beyond the glass like a field of silent witnesses. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Nadine. Please. Just talk to them. You don't know how bad things are. I put the phone face down and didn't pick it back up. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. A storm was coming. The next morning started like any other. Coffee, emails, meetings. I kept my face composed and my words efficient, but under the surface I felt like I was balancing on glass. By lunchtime, Jordan knocked on my office door with her tablet clutched to her chest. You're gonna want to see this. I took it from her and scrolled through the screen. A Facebook post had gone viral overnight. It featured a photo of me from a speaking event, standing behind a podium smiling in a navy blue blazer. Above it, the caption read, "This is Savannah Carver. She left her sick mother and unemployed father to die alone while she runs a $1 million company." My stomach turned. There were thousands of shares, thousands more comments. People tagging Mindtrace's page, flooding our inbox, leaving 1-star reviews with comments like "No soul. Just greed. Unbelievable. She owes them everything. Heartless success story." Some of the comments included threats. Some accused me of fraud, of exploitation, of building my career on tragedy and then abandoning the people who gave me life. I closed the tablet and handed it back to Jordan, trying to ignore the heat rising behind my eyes. Where did this start? She hesitated. Looks like a handful of accounts launched it around the same time. Same phrasing. Some of them have only existed for a few weeks. Fake names, stock photos, no real history. But one of them, the IP traces back to Camden County, Arkansas. My jaw locked. That's where they used to live. She nodded. I think someone's orchestrating this. Not just throwing it out there. Coordinated. I rubbed my temples, the pressure building between my eyebrows like a drumbeat. Loop in Grace. I want her here by the end of the day. That afternoon, Grace Menard swept into my office like a storm of tailored black wool and controlled fire. She dropped her bag on the chair and launched into it before I could even close the door. I've traced 6 accounts to Arkansas. 2 of them bounced through VPNs, but they slipped once or twice. The language is coordinated, Savannah. It's not random. And it's gaining traction. I leaned against the window, arms folded, my reflection merging with the Denver skyline. What are our options? We file. Defamation, impersonation, cyber harassment. The works. But it'll go public. The media will spin it. Could go either way. I exhaled through my nose. What if I don't want to give them that much power? Grace looked at me, her expression softening for a moment. Then we monitor, we gather, we prepare. And we make damn sure that when you do strike, it lands. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number. Guess what, sweetheart? We made you. Don't forget that. I didn't need to ask who it was from. I stared at the screen, every part of me still. The words weren't angry. They weren't desperate. They were smug, entitled. Like everything I'd built was still somehow theirs. I remembered the heat of that parking lot at 15. The silence that followed me for years. The hollow in my chest that used to be my parents'. They hadn't changed. They never would. I turned back to Grace, my voice steady. We file. No more waiting. She nodded once, the kind of nod lawyers save for clients who finally stop running. Good. Because this isn't just slander, this is war. For the rest of the day, I sat with my legal team. We combed through messages, documented timelines, assembled evidence. Jordan pulled archived emails, screenshots, everything the PR team had flagged since the story broke. At one point, I excused myself and went to the restroom. I locked the stall door, sat down fully clothed, and let the quiet surround me. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But I didn't. What I felt wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was focus. They had made a mistake. They had chosen the battlefield, but they forgot who they were dealing with. That night, I walked back to my apartment and sat by the window with a glass of water, watching the lights flicker across the city. Somewhere out there, Eugene and Darlene were probably scrolling through comments, watching numbers rise like stock tickers, believing they were winning. Let them think it. I opened my laptop, typed out a memo for the team, and scheduled a private meeting with PR and legal for the following morning. I wouldn't just protect my name, I'd protect every inch of what I'd built. This time, I wasn't the scared 15-year-old waiting for someone to come back. This time, I would decide how the story ended. When the invitation came from the Long Road podcast, I almost deleted it. The host, Lara Beck, was known for long-form interviews with people who had clawed their way out of something brutal. Trauma, injustice, loss. She asked hard questions and let silence breathe. Her episodes weren't sensational, they were surgical. Honest. Raw. The subject line of the email was simple. We'd love to hear your voice. I sat with it for a full day before replying. 2 weeks later, I walked into a quiet studio in downtown Denver with a bottle of water and my nerves packed tight in my chest. Laura greeted me in a soft sweater and jeans, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't ask how I was. She just offered me a seat, adjusted my mic, and nodded toward the blinking red light. Anytime you're ready. I took a breath. And I started. I talked about Arkansas. About the heat and the vending machines and the silence after my parents disappeared from that parking lot. I described calling Eliza, the drive to Vermont, the first time I slept in a house without flinching at footsteps in the hallway. I talked about MIT. About feeling invisible and then worse, hypervisible. I told her about Jeremy and the group project about the stairwell where I called Eliza after the solo presentation. Then I talked about Mindtrace. What it meant to build something no one could take from me. What it meant to finally be the author of my own story. And then I told her about what came after. The messages. The live stream. The lies. My parents standing in front of my company spinning pain into performance for strangers who didn't know a thing about what it meant to be left behind. There was a long pause when I finished. The studio was still. Just the low hum of equipment and my own heartbeat trying to slow itself down. Laura's voice was quiet. Why, now? Because they told the world a version of me that never existed. And for a while I let them. I stayed quiet. I thought it was strength, but silence lets liars keep speaking. She nodded once, then turned off the mic. The episode aired a week later. The impact was immediate. Emails poured in. Some from strangers who had gone through the same thing. Kids abandoned by parents who wore masks in public. Adults estranged from family members who weaponized guilt and shame. They weren't just responding. They were thanking me. Telling me they felt seen. The episode hit over 1 million plays in 3 days. Organizations that supported foster youth and survivors of family abuse shared it on their platforms. Therapists reposted quotes from the interview. A national morning show mentioned it in a segment about resilience. Then a journalist from the Republic Weekly reached out. She wanted to do a deep dive story. Not just about the tech company, about the whole thing. The parking lot, the podcast, the lawsuit Grace and I had filed. I hesitated. The more I said, the louder it all got. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just fighting for my name anymore. I was fighting for that 15-year-old girl in a bus station holding a bottle of water with no idea what came next. I agreed to the interview. A week later, I got a call from a number I hadn't blocked but should have. Nadine. I stared at the screen until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. The 4th time I picked up. Her voice was sharp, defensive. Why are you doing this? Why drag all of it into the open? I didn't say anything. You think people want to hear about old wounds. You think that makes you strong. I let her talk. I let her spill every drop of discomfort she'd been carrying. Then I said, you don't get to ask why I speak. Not when you spent years saying nothing. There was a silence on the other end. There are parents, Savannah. You can't just erase them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. They erased me first. I ended the call. That night I walked down to Commons Park just a few blocks from my building. The city was quiet, the sky overcast with the kind of gray that made streetlights look like lanterns. I sat on a bench near the river and let the breeze tangle through my hair. I wasn't angry. Not in that moment. I was tired. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Let the truth be louder. Let it echo. I wasn't hiding anymore. Grace didn't ask if I was ready. She just slid the papers across the table and watched as I signed them. Her office was quiet except for the soft clicks of her pen and the occasional hum of traffic outside the window. The words on the complaint form were heavy, permanent. Defamation. Misrepresentation. Business interference. Emotional distress. Intentional harm. Each count carefully crafted to strike where it hurt because for once I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story. We filed the lawsuit at 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday. By noon it was public record. The firm's media advisor advised us to stay quiet, let the filings speak for themselves. Grace, of course, disagreed. Letting liars control the silence is how they win, I agreed. Still, I didn't post anything. I didn't need to. Within hours, tech forums picked up the filing. A few outlets that had run the smear stories last month issued quiet corrections. A journalist who had reached out after the podcast asked for comment. I declined for now. That night, I stayed late at Mindtrace walking the halls of the office I had built. The lights were dimmed, the rooms empty. Even in silence, the place pulsed with purpose. Glass-walled conference rooms, the open dev pit, the polished steel server closet that hummed like a heartbeat. Everything they had tried to ruin still stood. The next day, Grace called to tell me Eugene had been served at a gas station just outside Camden. According to the process server, he tried to claim mistaken identity, then crumpled the papers and threw them in the trash before fishing them back out a minute later. Darlene was served later that afternoon while leaving a hair appointment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Public image over everything. Then late Thursday morning I got a message from Grace Nadine served. Witness. Expect contact. It didn't surprise me. She was the only one they hadn't dragged into their circus, at least not publicly. I expected resistance. An argument. A plea to keep things quiet. But instead, 2 hours later, I got a text from her. Can we meet? In person. Just us. I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen, the ache behind my ribs growing. We agreed on a halfway point, Wichita, a sleepy little cafe off a side street with mismatched chairs and plants that looked like they'd been watered more by luck than care. She arrived 10 minutes late. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup minimal. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in a while. I watched her scan the room, spot me, and hesitate before walking over. She sat down without saying anything. I didn't offer a smile. After a moment, she spoke first. I'm not here to defend them. Her voice was rougher than I remembered. Older, more worn. That's a surprise. I didn't mean it as a jab, but it landed like one. Nadine folded her hands on the table. I got the subpoena. I read the complaint. I read everything. I waited. They're freaking out. Dad keeps pacing the kitchen like someone's watching him. Mom keeps blaming you for everything, even stuff she did herself. It's exhausting. You picked your side a long time ago. I know. She looked down, eyes fixed on the table. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe it wasn't that bad. That maybe you'd overreacted or misremembered. Because if I admitted what really happened, then I had to admit I let it happen. Her voice cracked. I was older. I was supposed to look out for you. I stayed quiet. She swallowed hard. When you left, they told me you were unstable, ungrateful, that you'd come crawling back eventually, but you didn't. And every year that passed, every photo I saw, every article, they got angrier. Not because you left, because you didn't fail. That silence between us thickened, old grief stirred up like silt in water. She looked up, her expression hollow. I was jealous. I hated that you got out. That you got a new life. I thought it was luck. It wasn't, I know that now. She exhaled slowly. I've agreed to testify. Grace already called. I said yes. My throat tightened. Why? Because it's true. Because you deserve that much. Because for once I want to do something right. We sat there for a while. No food, no drinks. Just years of distance collapsing in silence. You don't owe me anything, I said. She nodded. I know. That's why it matters. She stood first. Good luck in court. I didn't stop her. I just watched as she walked out into the fading afternoon light, her shoulders a little straighter than before. After she was gone, I sat for a long time, letting the quiet settle. It wasn't closure, not yet. But it was something that tasted a little like peace. And maybe for the first time in my life, she wasn't hiding either. The courthouse in downtown Denver felt colder than it should have for mid-April. Gray marble floors, high ceilings, the soft echo of footsteps and whispers bouncing between wooden benches. I sat in the front row with Grace beside me, a manila folder open on her lap, filled with tabs and carefully labeled exhibits. Her heels tapped lightly against the tile in steady rhythm. I didn't ask if she was nervous. She wasn't the type, neither was I anymore. Eugene and Darlene sat across the aisle with their attorney, a man who looked like he belonged more in a used car commercial than in a courtroom. Darlene wore a pale scarf and light makeup, eyes carefully rimmed in red like she'd practiced the look. Eugene sat stiffly, arms folded, jaw clenched, as if he'd bitten into something bitter and couldn't spit it out. The judge entered. We rose. The bailiff's voice echoed through the room. Court is now in session. Opening statements were brief. Grace's voice was calm, deliberate, laced, with just enough weight to command attention without raising volume. She outlined our case like a timeline: misinformation, fake accounts, targeted defamation, provable damages. Their lawyer followed with his own pitch. Emotional. performative, full of phrases like elderly hardship and family misunderstanding. He gestured toward Darlene with reverence, called her a mother, clinging to hope. I kept my eyes forward. Then the evidence began. They led with photos: Darlene in a hospital gown, Eugene holding a stack of overdue bills, a printout of what was claimed to be a handwritten letter from me begging for forgiveness. The courtroom murmured as their lawyer spoke. This is a woman whose only crime was loving too much. A man left behind by the daughter he raised. Grace didn't object. She didn't need to. When it was our turn, she stood and held up a packet. Exhibit C. The IP log. She walked the judge through each data point. Posts traced directly back to a modem registered in Camden County. Matching timestamps. Fake profiles, all created within the same window. All promoting the same false narrative. Then she presented internal business data, client messages referencing the viral video email chains from investors expressing concern, screen captures of threats and harassment I'd received in the days following their live stream. Next came the clip itself. The live stream that started it all. We watched in silence as my mother clutched Eugene's arm, tears balanced carefully on her lashes, voice cracking just enough for the camera. I flinched only once when she looked directly into the lens and said, "Savannah, if you see this, please come home. We forgive you." Grace let the silence hang before she paused the video. Nowhere in this live stream did the defendants mention that they had not spoken to my client in over 20 years. That they left her alone at a bus station at 15. That they made no legal or formal effort to contact her. Instead, they weaponized public sympathy and social media to inflict harm. The room was still. Then Grace called her next witness. Nadine Carver. My sister walked to the stand with steady steps, a neutral gray blouse and black slacks, no jewelry. She looked older under the courtroom lights, but stronger somehow. More solid. She was sworn in, then sat. Grace kept her question brief. Did your parents attempt to contact your sister after she left home? Number. Did they try to locate her? Report her missing? Number. They told me she had chosen to leave. They never reported anything. When did they mention her again? Years later, when she was on the news. They were angry. Said she thought she was too good for us. And the live stream. It was Darlene's idea. She said it would get attention. They wanted her to feel public shame. Grace's voice didn't change. Why are you testifying today? Because for a long time I told myself staying quiet was the safest choice, but it was just the easiest. This isn't about sides anymore, it's about truth. And the truth is they never tried to bring my sister home. Not once. Someone behind me gasped. Darlene shifted in her seat, her hand tightening around a tissue. Grace thanked Nadine, nodded to the judge, and stepped back. Their lawyer rose for cross-examination, but it was sloppy. Nothing landed. Nadine didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Every answer was clean, calm, unwavering. Then, as the judge prepared to close the session for the day, Eugene stood up suddenly. His voice rang out across the room. She owes me. The judge barked at him to sit. She owes me her whole damn life. He was shouting now. You think all this came from nowhere? That brain, that grit, that came from me. I built her. I pushed her to be strong. You call it abuse, I call it parenting. Silence swept over the courtroom like a wave. I didn't move. He pointed at me, eyes wild. You think you're better than us now. With your suits and your fake name and your goddamn podcast we made you. The bailiff approached. The judge warned him once more. Eugene sat down heavily, breathing hard, Darlene whispering something into his ear. I turned to face him. I didn't speak. Not a word. Not a single tear. I just looked at him. And for the first time in his life I saw it land. Not the lawsuit. Not the evidence. My silence. That was the thing he could never control. The courtroom fell into a hush after Eugene's outburst, a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself refused to move. The judge didn't look up. He didn't need to. He simply tapped his gavel once and said we would reconvene at 3 p.m. for the verdict. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, but Grace moved quickly, shielding me with her body and words. No comment at this time. We ask that you respect the process." I didn't speak. I just kept walking, head high, hands still, my heels clicking sharp against the concrete, as if each step carved a line I refused to cross back over. I spent the next few hours in the quiet corner of a cafe down the street. I didn't eat. I just stared out the window, sipping lukewarm coffee while Grace reviewed notes beside me. She spoke now and then, mostly reminders about the judge's patterns, how he tended to rule on emotion but cited precedent like scripture. I wasn't listening. I was thinking about the train station. I was thinking about how long I had waited for someone to ask me if I was okay. No one ever did. Now the world had heard my story and the truth stood tall beside me. Not because I demanded it, but because I built it. At 3 p.m., we returned to the courtroom. Everyone was already seated. Eugene sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes bloodshot from rage or sleeplessness, maybe both. Darlene fidgeted with a crumpled tissue, the same one she'd clung to since morning. Nadine sat on the bench behind us. She didn't smile, she didn't need to. When the judge entered, the room rose in one synchronized motion. Then the verdict came. In favor of the plaintiff, my ears rang as he read the damages. A 6-figure penalty for defamation and willful business harm. A court order prohibiting Eugene and Darlene from contacting me or speaking about me publicly again, directly or indirectly, under penalty of further legal action. The courtroom didn't erupt, it exhaled. Grace leaned toward me and whispered, "It's done." But I already knew. Eugene said nothing. Darlene dabbed at her eyes, but there were no tears left to fake. Nadine stood slowly and left through the back door without looking at either of them. We walked out into late afternoon sun. The sky had cleared, the light warm on my face. I took a slow breath, and for the first time in years it filled me without pain. I didn't go home to Denver that night. I boarded a flight to Vermont. The drive from the airport to Eliza and Malcolm's house was quiet, the roads lined with soft green hills and old trees stretching into late spring. When I turned onto the gravel driveway, my chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected. Not from fear, from memory. Eliza was already on the porch, arms crossed, apron dusted with flour. Malcolm stood just behind her, holding a drink in one hand, a dish towel slung over his shoulder like always. "You hungry?" He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned and walked inside. Eliza hugged me before I made it up the steps. "We missed you," she said. Dinner smelled like comfort. Roasted garlic, herbs, something buttery in the oven. We sat at the same table where I had eaten my first meal in their home as a scared teenager. Nothing had changed. The creak in the third chair was still there. The mismatched salt and pepper shakers still sat like sentinels in the center. We didn't talk about the trial at first. We talked about the garden. About Malcolm's failed attempt at building a new shed. About Eliza's upcoming retirement. But eventually, between bites of lemon chicken and roasted carrots, Malcolm looked up from his plate. "Do you regret any of it?" The question wasn't pointed, it was honest. I set my fork down, looked at the window where dusk was beginning to pull shadows across the lawn. I regret not speaking up sooner. I regret believing that silence was safety. That if I stayed small enough, quiet enough, the damage would pass over me. Malcolm nodded slowly. "But I don't regret this," I added. Standing up. Setting boundaries. Saying no. He didn't press further. After pie, I climbed the stairs to the guest room. It looked exactly the same. The quilt folded neatly, the window cracked slightly to let the cool air in. A stack of books still sat on the shelf untouched. I sat at the small desk, opened my laptop, and found the folder labeled Carver Family. Inside were years of artifacts. Screenshots, emails, PDFs, legal files, news clippings. Every shred of pain I had ever tried to organize into logic. I hovered the cursor over it. Then I clicked delete. The computer asked me to confirm. Yes. Then I emptied the trash. It wasn't about erasing them. It was about releasing me. Downstairs, I heard Malcolm laugh, Eliza's voice rising in amused protest. A screen door squeaked and the cicadas outside had begun their slow summer chorus. I stood at the window and looked out over the backyard where wildflowers leaned into the last light of day. The trial was over. But this quiet, this peace, this space that held me without condition, this was the real victory. A new chapter had begun. And it would have nothing to do with them. 2 weeks after the verdict, a thick Sunday edition of the Denver Citizen landed on my doorstep with a weight that felt heavier than newsprint. The headline stretched across the fold in clean, simple type. From bus stop to courtroom, the truth. Behind Savannah Carver, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, flipping each page slowly, every breath measured. The feature wasn't written like a takedown or a tribute. It was a record, clear, unbiased. The journalist had pulled pieces from the podcast, court transcripts, public records, and interviews with Eliza, with Grace, even with Malcolm. He described me not as a victim or a villain, but as a girl who had been left behind and a woman who had learned not to disappear. The article ended with a line that made my throat tighten. Sometimes the hardest thing is not escaping your past, but choosing not to carry it with you. That afternoon, an email from the local Department of Human Services waited in my inbox. They were organizing a community event for adoptive families and children in transitional foster care, and someone had forwarded them my podcast. Would I be willing to speak? I didn't answer right away. I stared at the message for hours. I'd spent so long trying to build a life that didn't orbit what had been done to me, and now I was being asked to step into it again, not to explain, not to defend, but to offer something else entirely. I said yes. The event was held in a modest community center in Aurora. Folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, crayons scattered across tables in the back where children whispered and giggled while their parents listened to the speakers. There were about 50 people in the room, some couples who looked tired and hopeful at the same time, some single adults with open binders and highlighted pages in their laps, and a few families who had already adopted and were navigating the joy and chaos that came with it. I waited near the back, palms resting against my thighs, until someone called my name. I walked to the front, the microphone warm in my hand, the lights a little too bright. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I started by telling them about the bus station, about the soda bottle and the cracked pavement and the silence that followed after my parents drove away. I told them about calling Eliza Winslow, about arriving in Vermont with a bag of clothes and more fear than I could fit in words. Then I told them what happened after. I told them about MIT, about the boys who whispered behind my back, about the professor who believed in me anyway. I told them about Mindtrace, about building something from nothing, and about the day I stood in court and chose myself finally over them. But I didn't linger on the pain. I talked instead about what happened in between. About the years in Vermont when love looked like Malcolm's quiet sarcasm and Eliza's steady patience. About the nights I cried without hiding. About the first time I laughed without guilt. That's what saved me, I said. Not success. Not money. Love that didn't come with conditions. There was a pause after I finished. Some people were still. Others dabbed at their eyes. A woman in the back reached for her partner's hand. Then I saw her. Near the crayons and the juice boxes. A girl, maybe 10 or 11, hair in tight braids, face serious. She was staring at me with a look I recognized deep in my bones. Hope. Not the loud kind. The fragile kind, the kind that blooms only when someone dares to imagine that things might be different. She didn't smile, neither did I. I just nodded. Slowly. Once. Because I saw her. Because once someone had seen me. Afterward, a few people came up to say thank you. A man asked if I'd written any of it down. A woman said she was going to play the podcast for her teenage daughter. I answered kindly, but my eyes kept drifting back to the corner, where the girl now sat drawing something in silence, her knees pulled to her chest. Eliza had once told me that real healing doesn't always look like peace. Sometimes it looks like showing up. That night, I sat in my car outside the center for a long while before turning the key. I didn't feel exposed. I felt rooted. Not in what I had survived, but in who I had become. The porch creaked beneath my feet as I leaned back in the old wicker chair, a knit blanket tucked across my legs. The Vermont air was crisp, thick with the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Maple trees flamed gold and red across the ridge, the hills stretching quiet and endless beyond the Winslow fields. It was late afternoon, and everything in the world felt like it had taken a breath. My phone buzzed gently against the side table. A message from Nadine. Moved into the apartment this morning. Small but mine. No yelling. No silence either. Feels weird. Feels good. I smiled. Not a big one, just enough. The kind that doesn't need anyone to see it to matter. Another message popped up a moment later. Thanks. For everything. I didn't answer right away. I let the breeze carry that gratitude somewhere soft and quiet. Somewhere we didn't have to talk about it to understand it. The front door opened and Eliza stepped out with a mug of tea in each hand. She handed one to me, then settled into the chair beside mine. She was wrapped in a thick gray shawl, her reading glasses still pushed up into her hair. Heard from Grace today, I looked over. She's launching a mentorship program for women founders. Wants to know if you'll come talk to some of the applicants. No pressure. I took a slow sip. Tell her yes. Eliza nodded like she already knew I would. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the sky slowly turning amber. The last of the light caught the tops of the trees, glowing like stained glass. There's a girl, Eliza's voice was quiet. She just started at the school this week. 6th grade. Placed with a foster family 2 towns over. Came to us with almost nothing. Not even a backpack. Refuses to speak more than a few words. Doesn't look anyone in the eye. The teachers are worried. I waited. Eliza turned toward me. I didn't tell her about you, but I thought maybe if you wanted to come by sometime. I finished my tea. Tomorrow. The next morning I walked into the familiar halls of the middle school where Eliza still volunteered part-time. The floor tiles hadn't changed, the scent of pencil shavings and old books lingered like muscle memory. She led me to a quiet office near the counselor's wing where a small girl sat at the far end of the room, legs pulled up into the chair, arms folded tight. She looked up briefly when I walked in, then looked down just as fast. Her hair was tied back into a messy braid. Her jeans were too short. Her sneakers had mismatched laces. She couldn't have been more than 11. Eliza gave me a nod and stepped out, leaving the door ajar behind her. I pulled a chair over not too close and sat. We didn't speak for a while. Finally, she mumbled, "Are you the lady from the podcast?" I nodded. She fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. Everyone says I'm a problem kid. I didn't respond. Just waited. They say I have an attitude. That I don't try. That I make stuff up. She met my eyes for the first time. But I don't. I just... Nobody listens. My chest tightened. What's your name? She hesitated. Jordan. I nodded again. Hi, Jordan. Another pause. Do you think someone like me could ever do something big? Even if nobody believes I can. I leaned forward, voice low and even. You don't need anyone to believe in you right now. She blinked, confused. You just need to not give up on yourself. Not ever. Jordan didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. That was enough. Later, as I walked back to the car, Eliza caught up to me at the steps. She talked a little. Eliza's eyes softened. She's strong, but scared. So was I. Eliza placed a hand on my shoulder. Not anymore. That night I sat on the back porch again, same blanket, same sky. My phone buzzed again. Grace had sent over a list of young founders I'd be meeting next month. Women from all over the country. Women with ideas and grit and stories of their own. The world kept moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was chasing it. I felt like I was part of it. If you've ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you, if you've ever been told you weren't enough and still found the strength to keep going, I want to hear your story. Drop a 1 in the comments if any part of this felt like your life. Or let me know where you're watching from. And if you're still carrying something heavy, just know this: choosing peace isn't weakness. It's power. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories like this. We're just getting started.